Alright, so first off, I want to talk about the difference between genealogical ancestry and genetic ancestry. So let's take our parents. We're getting 50% of our DNA from our mother, 50% of our DNA from our father. Now let's go back one more generation. We're getting 25% of our DNA from each grandparent. So now we'll go back another generation. Our great-grandparents are only giving us 1/8 of our DNA. And when it gets to about 15 generations, most of our ancestors aren't giving us any DNA. But they're still our genealogical ancestor. But they're not really our genetic ancestor anymore because they're not giving us any of their DNA. You see how that works? So you can be somebody's ancestor without giving them any genetic information. So just from the idea of scientists having 20% of a skeleton, I didn't think there was a lot of validity to the idea. I mean, there was a lot of mistakes. They were using pigs' teeth and stuff like that to try and prove something. But it's the genetics that made me think, yeah, this is something real. There's something true to this. So that we've mapped out the human genome. We understand what the human DNA looks like. So we can test the genetics of the Neanderthals through their bones, and you can tell that that skull is not really a human skull. It's not really a gorilla's skull or anything like that. It's larger than a human skull. It has a stronger bite. It's got more of a eyebrow jolting out. You can tell there's some differences. I mean, it's a little elongated in the back. So when we actually look at the genetics of this compared to human genetics, it's different. And you can actually see Neanderthal DNA in human DNA. You know, that there was some interbreeding, so they're close enough that they could interbreed. So you have to think about this when you're holding a Judeo-Christian view of the world. You have to think, what were these Neanderthals? Were these the giants? Were these like interbred human and fallen angels? Or were these some type of an evolutionary step to go from chimpanzees to humans? So a gorilla skull would look very different. They would have fangs, and they wouldn't have that hyoid bone. The only species alive today that has this hyoid bone is humans, and it's something that goes along with advanced speech. Because animals, they can make noises, but it takes a lot of just like articulation with your speech to be able to have more complex speech, like languages and stuff like that. So yeah, you'll see that the Neanderthals has that hyoid bone, so that leads scientists to believe that they had complex speech patterns, like language. Alright, so when you're holding the Judeo-Christian worldview and you look at these Neanderthals, you have to ask, are they made in the image of God? So if you take the image of God as being a certain set of like physical attributes, then you could say yes or no on that. But you may take the idea of the image of God as being like consciousness, or something like being aware that you exist. There was interbreeding, so how much Neanderthal would you have to have in you in order to not be made in the image of God, to not be human? Because you do see Neanderthal DNA in our DNA today. So were they just a different kind of human? This is a hard question. So does it really matter that they're in the distant past? What if we brought them back today? Because you can take genes from the teeth of Neanderthals, put them in CRISPR and mess with them a little bit, change some stuff. And there's only like a few small things that are different between human genes and the genes of the Neanderthal. But there are differences. So what does that mean? So what if they were human? But what if you could be human but not made in the image of God? What if those were two things that you could separate? So say everyone today is a human and made in the image of God and a descendant of Adam and Eve. But what if there was a development separate, like we'll say Genesis 1 was talking about evolution, used the word Elohim, like the spirits made earth, made animals come from just plain water to fish to mammals to humans, and that was one thing. And then maybe in Genesis 2, when you're talking about Yahweh creating man out of the dirt and creating it in his image, maybe that's a separate thing, and maybe the Garden of Eden is Adam and Eve and the descendants of Israel come from that. Yeah, I don't know. This is a very difficult question theologically. So what if we did find out there were Neanderthals alive today? on some island in the Pacific Ocean somewhere, and these Neanderthals wanted to have a Judeo-Christian worldview and wanted to accept Christ in that way. What if aliens wanted to? What if we had someone come from an intelligent life form from another planet come, and they wanted to accept this Judeo-Christian worldview? Being unhuman, would they not be allowed to? Or is it just being conscious and intelligent that makes you made in the image of God? What is the image of God? So right now with this topic, we are separating theological ideas from actual scriptural ideas, because obviously there's nowhere in any type of scripture that's going to be talking about Neanderthals. Just like there's nowhere that's going to talk about electricity or genes or things they don't understand. This obviously is not a science book, and if it was a science book, it probably wouldn't have been written that long ago. Let's say 2,000 years ago. So let's go back to the earliest writings, like maybe 6,000 years ago. Say God is coming to Ezekiel, and he's like, Ezekiel, I'd really like you to write this book, but you're just so stupid. You don't understand physics, you don't understand biology. How can I get you to write this book? People are going to laugh at you. Now, let's say, what if he did understand those things and he was speaking to that audience back then? Wouldn't that sound kind of silly? Nobody would really understand him. They might discount this book as something that's just ridiculous, if you're speaking about something that they didn't understand. So what if God had waited and he had let Stephen Hawking or Richard Dawkins write a book of the Bible? In 1,000 years, 2,000 years, people would be laughing and scoffing at how little they knew and how silly it sounded, the science that they were talking about. So no matter when you write this down, in 1,000 years it's going to be outdated. So you can't make a science book. You can make a work of poetry or literature, and that's going to stand the test of time. But if you're making a science book, it's just not going to last. So yeah, there's no real word for human in the Bible, but Adam is humankind, and it's used. That's what's kind of used for human. So if you look at the scriptures, everything that has to do with the image of God is all in that Adam and Eve story. So it's not really denying that there could be people outside of the garden that are humans, but maybe they could be humans and not in the image of God in some way. Maybe it's not a qualitative thing. It's just like something given to them. But this just makes me feel uncomfortable. You want to think if something had intelligent thought and it had feelings and it had a consciousness and understood that it existed, because we can't really prove that animals can understand that they exist and understand that they are an entity, that have consciousness. But you think if something is intelligent enough to have consciousness, that would be what the image of God is. It's hard to explain this. So you could use the story of Cain and Abel, where Cain kills Abel. He's afraid to leave Adam and Eve because he's afraid of someone outside of that area, like a population outside of the Garden of Eden. To say, yes, there were people outside of the garden, but maybe they weren't necessarily made in the image of God, whatever that would mean. This can be dangerous because people have used this over the years for taking rights away from certain groups of people, saying that they weren't made in the image of God. So when the Europeans started discovering different kinds of people, like the Aborigines in Australia, they thought that these people might be the missing link. This was after, the whole theory of evolution and everything. And yeah, it made them not give them quite full human rights. They were hunting them down, cutting their skulls open, dissecting them and stuff like that. And they found out that yes, they were humans. They just were different. So let's say we brought back the Neanderthal and he could interbreed with humans. Then he'd be a human. If you can breed with humans, you're a human. And the thing is, if you do bring back a Neanderthal, we would actually have a separate race. So right now, with the Human Genome Project, we know that we're all one race, the human race. All Homo sapiens are the same race. There's tiny little differences between if you've been in the sun more or something like that. but there's not actually different races. Now, if they were to bring back a Neanderthal, we would have the Homo sapien race and we'd have the Neanderthal race, but we could interbreed still. So that would be something that if the government really wanted to push racism, they could bring back the Neanderthal, actually create a separate race. Because right now we're all part of the same race. We've traced back the human genome. We understand we all came from one man and one woman. So let's say we find an island. It's full of Neanderthals. Humans have a history when they find people that they assume are lesser than them to kind of invade and conquer, and bad things would probably happen. And if we had that extra step of saying, like, these people are not made in the image of God, we are, that'd just be an extra step to help push us. You know, say we brought back a Neanderthal and they were smarter than any other creature besides humans, but they weren't quite up to the level of human intelligence. But they were much smarter than all of the animals. We would still probably treat them very badly. Probably because we'd also be insecure because they're so much closer to us than the animals. Cain leaving really seems to start society. So he's associated with technological progression and like the beginning of societies. But it leaves it open enough that you could say there were societies before Cain went out and built the city. It doesn't say he built the first city, it just says he built a city, and then, you know, he's making swords and weapons, and he's starting. It's very negative. It's looking at technological advancement in kind of a negative way. So Neanderthals never really got to experience society. And they probably wouldn't have liked it very much. They probably wouldn't have wanted to stay inside or get on social media. They probably would have wanted to be outside like an animal. There are things that do understand that there are things that recognize their own existence that still don't have a consciousness. So let's look at AI. Let's think about animals as being like AI. Let's think about them as having the ability to react to stimuli and think and do things that help them last longer, do things that are beneficial to them, but not necessarily having a consciousness. Alright, so we say that, but the only consciousness that we can really prove is our own consciousness, because we're inside ourselves. We understand that we know of something called our mind. We know who we are, and we have consciousness. But you can't even prove another person's consciousness. Another person could be responding to stimuli like an AI or like a robot, and maybe nothing is actually living inside of them. You know the viewer, the thing living inside of you, like that, it makes you human. It's a conscious. So there's a difference between your genealogical ancestry and your genetic ancestry. And when you go back in time, generations back, you're related to more and more people. I don't know if you've ever done the Ancestry.com or anything like that, but could there have been two people 6,000 years ago, and could those two people have created all 7 billion people on the earth today? So you're taking two people like 300 generations ago, and if you extrapolate the data and figure out how many descendants they could have had, the number is extremely large, something like 2 times 10 to the 90th power. So of course, two people, a man and a woman, 6,000 years ago could have fathered and mothered all of humanity. But then we find out there are actual bones of other kinds of creatures, Neanderthals, that have similar genetics to us, but slightly different genes. So we have to kind of think rationally and figure out, were these humans, where did they come from? So we have to think about, who were these Neanderthals? So scientific problems with Genesis or with the Bible have nothing to do with salvation. So like the writers of the Bible. They may have been illuminated on the idea of salvation or spirituality, but they're just as ignorant as people of their day in the sciences. They're not going to know everything about science. There's going to be a lot of limitations on their science. And if it's something that they weren't eyewitness to, like Genesis, like the creation of the world, of course they're not going to fully understand the creation of the earth. So the idea of Adam and Eve is not a scientific impossibility. It's definitely something that could work scientifically. When it comes to long periods of time like that, you'd be like a genetic ghost to that ancestor. So that ancestor would have bred with someone else, and there would be so many people back in that gene pool that it would almost be impossible to trace you back to that person. So maybe you could say that maybe these were people that had a disease or that lived for a very long time, like hundreds of years, and that's how the skull would change over time. But you find younger kid Neanderthals. Maybe those were just smaller old people, but there seems to be more than just the genes that we're dealing with, because you find these all over Europe, and some people will say the Denisoans are the Asian Neanderthals, so you'll find them all over Asia as well. So this video has no answer yet. Maybe one day, maybe we'll bring a Neanderthal back. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, honestly. What would happen in that situation? But it's possible. It's becoming more and more possible to bring back a mammoth or to bring back a Neanderthal, and you know, that creature would probably be very famous. So I can't give you an answer here. I just wanted to get some thoughts out here, get people thinking about these ideas. I'm going to be making a lot more videos like this. I've got some interesting ones to come, so stay tuned for that. I'm kind of mixing theology and science. Yeah, two subjects that are definitely usually kept very far away from each other. So I think it's interesting. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hit that subscribe button, and thanks for watching.